We have a breaking news update in a shocking case of a dad accused of killing his daughter on the final day of their 10-day vacation before they returned home. Luciano Frattolin is now in jail in New York. Here he is walking to his first court appearance per WNYT. He seemed to live the high life, traveling the world, driving fancy cars, and showering his daughter, his only child, with love, who he once called the light of his life. Which makes this story so hard to understand, and it raises so many questions. Why would he allegedly kill his daughter? Well, we have learned more about his background, which reportedly suggests that his reality was not as flashy as the image that he projected. We're on the case presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. Before we get back to this episode of On the Case, I want to take a moment and bring you a Law&Crime legal alert, because did you know that children are being diagnosed with serious conditions like type 2 diabetes and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and research is potentially linking ultra-processed foods to these outcomes? Our partners at Morgan & Morgan are stepping in to fight to hold food companies accountable. They have decades of experience fighting large corporations, and they're ready to stand up for families who deserve justice. So if your child under 21 has been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, go to www.forthepeople.com/food. You can also scan this QR code on your screen or click the link below. Right before we posted this video, we learned the cause of death in this case. It is a case that is just so difficult to comprehend, and there are still so many questions. Before I get to that cause of death, let me break down some of the latest that we have in this story and how we got to this point. Luciano Frattolin has pleaded not guilty to allegedly murdering his 9-year-old daughter, Melina. Before I get to the new information that we are learning about his background, let me get you caught up on this story. Police say on July 11th, Melina and her dad started a 10-day trip for vacation, just the two of them. They both lived in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. They came into the United States to spend time in New York and Connecticut. Again, this was just a dad and daughter trip. Luciano is the founder of a coffee company based in Montreal. It appeared that Luciano was a successful entrepreneur and business person. He called Melina, quote, the light of his life. He also said Melina was, quote, inspiration for, well, everything. And it was just 15 weeks ago. That's a little more than just 3 months. Here is a video of Melina at her 9th birthday party, and this was on her dad's Instagram. And here's a picture that he posted at that 9th birthday party, giving her a big hug and a kiss on the head. Police say Saturday night around 10 o'clock, Luciano called 911 outside of Lake George, New York. Just a few hours prior, police say that Luciano and Melina were spotted at a restaurant in nearby Saratoga Springs, New York. But Luciano in this 911 call was claiming that something had gone horribly wrong. He told police that he pulled over to the side of the road to go to the bathroom, but at that moment, 2 men driving a white van pulled up and yanked Melina out, abducting her, and then they took off in the opposite direction. This is the picture that went out with the Amber Alert that law enforcement triggered for Melina. This was shared across the internet, but in the next few hours and over the next day, police say they found out that the story of the abduction was a lie. They found inconsistencies, they say, in Luciano's story, and he was detained. Then, just before 2 o'clock on Sunday, police were in Ticonderoga, New York, which is near the Vermont border, and they were searching a wooded area. This was about 45 minutes north of where that 911 call was made. They say in that wooded area, they found Melina's body. She was left in a shallow pond, according to police. And we just learned the cause of death. Police say that Melina died of asphyxiation due to drowning. Her body allegedly left behind in that shallow pond in a wooded remote area of upstate New York, and her own father, police say, is the man responsible. Police say before her death Saturday night, Melina actually was on the phone with her mom. She had called around 6:30 to tell her that she and her dad were on their way back to Canada. Here's what New York State Police during their news conference said about that.
At about 6:30 p.m., she spoke to her mother on the phone and told her she and her father were en route back to Canada. The child appeared to be in good health and did not indicate she was under any duress. The investigation has determined sometime after Melina's phone call with her mother And before Mr. Frattolin's 911 call, he allegedly murdered Melina and left her body in a remote area where she was later discovered by law enforcement.
At the time of this recording, we don't know the alleged motive in this case, but it is notable that police said this in that news conference.
They were expected to return to Canada on Sunday, July 20th, at which time Melina would be returned to the custody of her mother in Montreal. The mother and Mr. Frattolin had been estranged since 2019. The child resided full-time with her mother, and Frattolin visited with the child when in Canada.
On the website of the coffee company that lists Luciano as the founder, there's a post that said in 2019, he was met with an unfortunate event that severely impacted his well-being. This is according to the Canadian news outlet City News. It's unclear what he meant by that unfortunate incident, but that 2019 timeline lines up with the year that police say he became estranged from his wife. It's important to note that his coffee company's website and social media have been taken down. Frattollin's social media showed him living a lavish lifestyle, a true jet setter going all across the world. This is a video from his Instagram posted 5 weeks ago of him touring a garage of luxury cars. Here's another video in Europe of him driving luxury vehicles. Now, his social media and his coffee business, that gave the impression publicly that this was a man who had money to spend. He has a lot of pictures showing that he brought Melina with him on these vacations as well across the world, showering her with love and with gifts. But today we're learning from a report by the Gazette newspaper, which is out of Montreal, that Luciano was involved in 5 lawsuits that were all filed this year. Now, he's the plaintiff in 4 of the lawsuits, but in the 5th lawsuit, the newspaper says he is the defendant and he is being sued by a bank for more than $83,000. Now, it doesn't go into more detail about what the suits were over. But whatever those legal issues are, they certainly pale in comparison to what he is now dealing with. This is video of Luciano ahead of his first court appearance yesterday in Ticonderoga, New York, per WNYT. You can see he didn't show a lot of emotion, even as reporters asked him questions.
Mr. Frattolin, do you have anything to say? Do you have anything to say about these charges?
A public defender entered a not guilty plea on his behalf at that court appearance, and the New York Post wrote that Frattolin said he can't hire an attorney because he's broke. Join us now to talk more about this case is family law attorney Randy Kessler. Always great to have you on Law and Crime. This is a very, very sad case, and it seems like there's some sort of, we don't officially know the motive at the time of this recording, but there was some custody that was brought up by law enforcement, and then it appears that he was also being sued. What do you take of what we know thus far about what law enforcement may have to work with when it comes to a motive?
This is, the definition of circumstantial evidence, right? It's one of those cases where, motive really never is supposed to matter. You don't have to prove why somebody did something. But in this case, you need something to explain why you think he did it, right? And that's sort of the issue. And we were talking, Chris, before we went on air that, some cases, there were restraining orders and lots of vitriolic behavior between the parties, and it didn't seem like that existed here. So it might be a more psychological basis. We were talking about, maybe he had money or wanted the world to think he had money, but it turns out he doesn't have money. And maybe, his relationship with his ex-wife is estranged, but deep inside, he wanted her back and knew he couldn't get her back. And this is what he did to say, if I can't have her back, then I'm going to hurt her. I mean, all those kind of things. But from a legal point of view, does that equal a murder conviction? Do you get, reasonable doubt? There's lots of reasonable doubt. I just want to know what the police know. I want to know how strongly they feel they've caught him lying, because they've got to have something that made them think, we got you.
And you've seen a lot of these cases, certainly when they get to, we often talk about some really sad cases when they get to the legal part of it and an arrest has been made. And I just think back to this story that he initially gives investigators of he pulls over to the side of the road to go to the bathroom on this drive back, to Quebec. And he's in, they're outside of Saratoga, New York, or Lake George, wherever it may be. And then a white van pulls up, 2 men take his daughter, and it speeds south. And it just seems like in some of these stories, though you have to investigate every call like it's serious and follow every lead, sometimes these very sensational stories, maybe in his head it thought was a good idea, it just seemed police were pretty quick to be able to break it all down.
Yeah, I don't know how they could disprove it. Maybe there were cameras, close by that didn't see any such car going, anywhere within that time period. But, first blush, I thought that's a pretty clever story, like because there's no eyewitnesses. He's not saying I'm a perfect person. He's urinating on the side of the road, which is illegal. So he's owning up to doing something wrong. It's a very human story. Like, I really had to go and I shouldn't have done it. And I'm sorry for I did it, but I didn't kill my daughter. So it sounds like a pretty credible story, and maybe it is credible. I just want to know how the police know that story doesn't match up because he had this story and he described the white van. Maybe if he'd said, I heard his car and I turned around, she was gone. But yeah, in a rural neighborhood, a rural area, you wouldn't think that there are video cams and security cameras and lots of passersby. So somehow or another, these police have done their job. You got to feel pretty darn strongly to arrest somebody for murder that you can make sure that their story doesn't match up. And I'm pretty sure that they've got a good feel for it.
And it's just and it's part of the job. When you work for Law and Crime, you're going to be covering really sad stories from time to time, and this is certainly one of them. And you just go through his social media, and this is someone who seemed, he had one child, it was his daughter, he has his coffee company, says she was the light of his life. He worshiped this girl, and then she ends up dead, and he's now accused in the murder. Sometimes it's hard to make sense of it, but for you, just kind of being in the world of you see some tough cases when it comes to the world of family law. I mean, what stands out to you of where it seems like there was no indication that this could happen?
Well, first of all, you feel for the family. You feel for the mom, most of all, and maybe you feel for the dad. And again, right? It's law and crime, and in crime in America, you're innocent until proven guilty. So, I mean, our first feeling should be exactly what you're describing. This guy who loved his daughter has lost his daughter, and God forbid the police are wrong, and we've sort of instead of sympathizing with him, we're pointing the finger at him. So the first step is, you know, we hope. That's why I keep saying I hope they have really good evidence because to have these feelings of anger towards the father for taking this young girl's life, they better be legitimate. I don't want to just leap to that anger. None of us should be leaping to that anger unless law enforcement's done a really good job. But if they're right and if he is guilty and if he's going to be the one found to have done it, boy, then my mind jumps to a lot of places. Social media portrays a different picture for people. A lot of times it's what people want their life to be. They want to show that they're having a good life. They don't post the bad stuff because they don't want people to think that they've got flaws or blemishes or that they're not happy. And so I certainly wonder what's going on behind the scenes. But the more people post about how good things are, maybe you got to dig a little deeper. And I think you've done a little digging, Chris. And apparently his financial life wasn't what he portrayed on social media, and that starts to open the door to what else wasn't true.
Right,
But
and we're still looking into it. I know the main newspaper in Montreal where he lives, he's a defendant in 4 lawsuits, and there's a bank that wanted $83,000 from him, and that is certainly a contrast to the social media where he owns this coffee company. Their social media has been taken down on their website, but it was like this organic coffee company based in Ethiopia that he ran out of Montreal. I mean, it just seemed like this was a guy who had it together. But then you also learn about the custody issues, and we don't know if that was a motive for this, but the daughter was going to be returned the next day to the full custody of the mom. How, when it comes to determining custody situations in families, what does because he was able to go on a 10-day vacation with
yeah,
his daughter. How does, for when I think of full custody, I think, oh, only the mom only can see it and the dad doesn't really get
yeah.
to. What's the reality?
Well, let me get to that, but you made me think of something else that I've just got to say, which is you can't minimize the hurt. Some people they don't get to see their kids ever, and you say they're justified in being angry. But this guy who had time was allowed to have a vacation. He should be happy with that. No, this was his life, and at one point in time, he had full custody. I'll get to your question, which is when you're
Sure.
married, you have a child, both parents have equal custody, you have joint custody. And so at some point in time, his life went from being able to see his daughter whatever he wanted, even if they were separated and the child was at mom's house, legally, if you're married, you can go to mom's house and take your child, and she can come to your house and take your child back. You both have full rights. The law can't tell you what to do with your own child. And so at some point in time, his world transitioned to I only have the rights to be with my daughter that this judge says I have or that I agree to, and I'm limited. So that's pain, and that may cause a lot of the feelings. But back to your question, we sort of want to ignore the word custody because we don't anymore say he's got custody and she visits. there's always some form or variation of joint custody. Primary custody is with mom, secondary custody is with dad, or joint periods of custody. So the world's the limit, the sky's the limit as far as what a court can do. But the bottom line is the court tries to say, you all figure this out. You all share your child fairly, equitably. But if you can't, I'm going to give you a schedule that you can bank on so that if dad says, I'm not getting any time with my child, he can pull out the document that says, my parenting time, my periods of custody, my visitation, whatever you call it, is this. And this was apparently one of those times where he had the extended time to take his child on a vacation. But when you negotiate this stuff, the best thing lawyers can do for people is instill a sense of, don't look at the paperwork, try to work it out. If she needs an extra weekend because there's an event, let her have it. And hopefully she gives you extra time when you need it. Because if you can do that, you won't need lawyers, you won't need courts, and you won't end up in situations like this, hopefully, if you just cooperate.
Right. And again, we don't know what officially the motive was, but it was notable that New York State Police pointed that out in their news conference, saying that the timeline was that this vacation was about to come to an end and the daughter was going to go back to the full custody of his estranged wife. For people who haven't been in that world, when it comes to someone getting full custody, and I'm not trying to speculate related to this case, but I think of like full custody, something happened, or the father may have a history of domestic violence, which this man does not.
Right.
But like, what can be some of the factors that would lead the court? And I know it's Canadian and Quebec, and it might be different than the United States. But
It's family law. Best
yeah,
interest of the child
what's
is
the difference? Like, what leads to that?
So really the judge's job is not about who's a bad person. And I'll tell you this, Chris, I've talked to thousands of judges over my 35, 40 years of practicing family law. Every judge to a person would say, I'd rather be the judge for a murder trial or a death penalty case than have to decide custody. Because in a murder trial, somebody did something wrong. In a custody case, you've got innocent children, and the judge is tasked with figuring out what's best for the child. And it's a very vague standard. What's in the child's best interest? Not who's a better person, who's a better parent. It's what situation, what arrangement is best for the child. So judges have to come up with something based on their limited knowledge of this family. And so when you say what goes into it, well, you look at stability historically. What has been the system with that child? Who has fed the child? Who's brought the child to the doctors? Who is the child bond with? Who teaches the child homework? And the judge tries to get a picture of what would be better, more stable for the child and put that situation in place. But judges hate it because they're social engineering. They're trying to figure out what's best for the child. One other question that you sort of implied was, dad was giving the child back. And, that's a hard thing. And you said not everyone's been through that, but everyone who's got children has been through something like that, whether it's becoming an empty nester when your child's going to leave home or your child gets their driver's license and now they're not home all the time. This is dad spent this great amount of time this week with his child. And all of a sudden he was so happy and he's got to give his child back and he's going to be sad. And if he's got psychological issues that are, in his head, that's a tough time to give your child away and then to have to be without your child. It's a lot worse in cases where you hate the other spouse and the other spouse is alienating your child and telling bad things about you to your child. But even in a situation like this, when we don't know if that exists, he still had the happiest moments of his life with his daughter. And then he was giving up the happiest thing in his life to someone who lives in another country. The brain does some crazy things and makes you do some crazy things. And I pray he didn't do this and this wasn't one of them, but it could easily be.
Yeah. When it comes to, and I agree, you just, when it is one of those cases, to your point, like you just hope, not that you hope, but if you're going to arrest somebody and charge them with murder, that there is the evidence that this happened. And they say they chased that lead of the white van and they triggered an Amber Alert and they followed through with that, police say, and they don't believe that was true. Not to have you make a leap on this, but knowing that we found out today, just through the reporting of the main newspaper in Montreal, that he's a defendant in 4 lawsuits, including an $83,000. A bank wants $83,000 from him. So apparently he's in some debt potentially. Is that something that a judge would look at and determine? And I don't know. I also give this disclaimer. I don't know about how long the custody situation is, what it's been, but is that also something, the financial situation, that a judge would look at in determining where a child would be best fit with the mom or the dad?
Oh, in a custody case, certainly more than in a murder case, but in a custody case, it wouldn't be so much the financial responsibility. A lot of people say to me, Mr. Kessler, I've got a lot of money and my spouse doesn't have money, so I should get custody because I can take care of the child. And I say, well, you know what the judge can do? The judge can use some of your money to help you support the child when the child's with the other side. So money issues aren't always important. So it's not the fact that he owes money that would get me, Chris. It would be the fact that he's not stable, not honest, deceive somebody. If that's what happened, if he owes money because he engaged in some bad judgment. And really what it's about for judges is judgment. Somebody's going to be in charge of this child. Judges rarely do an equal 50-50. They're going to have somebody be the main parent. The main parent should be the person that's the most stable, the most consistent, the most likely to raise this child in a way that's going to give this child the best future. Someone who's got a lot of lawsuits and is accused of, not paying a lot of debts, that could weigh into it. I'd want to know more about the background of the lawsuits, but certainly it could be a factor.
We don't know specifically his financial situation, but that bank lawsuit that one in particular sticks out just because that's the only real number we have, $83,000 reportedly a bank wanted from him. He was in court in New York yesterday. And even though, again, social media doesn't tell the entire story, but he loved Porsche. He traveled all over the world. He runs this coffee company, apparently, that was still in business, still is in business, but he says he doesn't have money. What typically is the bar for someone to get a public defender and where that money comes from and whether you're eligible for it?
Well, you don't really have to go through an analysis and prove that you can't afford one because then you'd have people, lying. You're entitled to a lawyer. If you say you can't afford one, the court appoints one for you. Now, if you end up having a lot of money and you just wanted a public defender, there are two things wrong with that situation. Number one, the court could always come and say, listen, you took money from the taxpayers you didn't need. But more importantly, there's a perception that public defenders are not as good as private lawyers. That's not necessarily true because they're in the trenches. But what is true is that public defenders are overwhelmed, right? We just don't have enough money to pay a lot of public defenders. And the ones that are really good, they're really good. But if they're really good, they go out and they practice law and they make a lot more money. So that, you have young lawyers coming in. So if you have money and you're accused of a crime, usually you're going to try to find a private lawyer who might have been a public defender at one point in time, but now has got such a good reputation and does such good work that they can command higher fees. So whether he has money for a public defender or not, he's entitled to one in America. That's Gideon versus Wainwright. You're entitled to a lawyer to defend you. And if he wants a public defender, the court's going to give him one, unless he's already got one or unless there's some. And even if there's a conflict and there's a co-defendant who's got the public defender already, then the court can draft a criminal lawyer that's a private lawyer and say, we need you to do this, and we need you to do some service on behalf of the state. So he'll get a public defender if he wants one, and if he says he can't afford one.
I asked a question yesterday to our guest, who was a former FBI agent, and it was just about, even though we don't know a motive, police were saying, you had this exchange of custody that was going to happen with the child, and you were talking about how emotional that is. And sadly, we've talked about some cases where these, there can be very difficult circumstances surrounding that. And I know the expert we had on yesterday said, when I asked, how do we prevent some of these cases from happening if it is something where it was just the emotions of that leads to something as terrible as what he's accused of? And he said, well, then you're looking for something along the lines of like a Department of Pre-Crime, and it's hard to predict. It's in so many ways it's reactionary, and it doesn't seem like there were a lot of red flags, at least at this point in the relationship between the father and the child. But just in your experience working in family law, what are some of the things in these circumstances? Because I feel like we've talked about these stories a good bit where just stuff like this seems to unfortunately happen around these types of exchanges.
Well, your guest was obviously pretty smart. It's like you need a division of mind readers.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think there was a Tom Cruise movie about that where,
it was Minority Report, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And then, so how do you predict this? And even if there was that situation, this one had the least indication that something like this would happen. There are cases where you clearly could have seen something coming a lot clearer than this. But he's right. Your guest was right. You've got to go after the people that have already committed crimes before you start worrying about people that might commit crimes, and that's the problem. So, how do you do that? You try to craft a good custody resolution. You also try to be good to your ex-spouse. And I'm not blaming mom at all. It sounds like they had a good relationship. She let the child go, but it sounds like she did everything she could from the little bit that I know. But, when you irritate people and love's involved and anger and romance and sex and all of a sudden you're divorcing somebody and you're rejecting them and you're not letting him or her see their child and you're exerting control over them. People just react, right? And family law is one of those, people react. They don't think about for 3 years, well, when my daughter turns 13, they're just angry and they do stupid stuff because they think it's going to make them feel better. You know, I have clients all the time that say, I want to go to court, Mr. Kessler. I don't want to take that settlement. And I say, the settlement's exactly what's going to happen in court, more or less, you know, and it costs a lot less. They say, but if the judge hears my side of the story, they're going to go with me. And I try to say to them, there's another side to the story. And the judge is going to hear both sides. And it's really a math problem for the judge. People have their own sense of what's right and what's wrong, and they want vindication. And, you know, the best thing we can do is tell people, take a breath, you know, measure twice, cut once is one of my favorite sayings. Let people step back, think about what you would tell a friend to do. But there's no panacea. There's no one solution for how do you stop stuff like this, except education, you know, alarm bells, and make sure that people know. But, you know, can you say no parent should let their child go with the other parent because something like this might happen? I mean, how about all the wonderful parenting times that people have post-divorce, or people that weren't married that have to share their child? You know, there's some children that have wonderful relationships with both parents. And I would hope that's the majority. But, you know, stuff like this, if I knew how to fix it, I'd be very smart or very rich or both.
No, incredibly well put. Just such a sad story out of New York, and we'll learn more, you know, potentially about a motive as New York State Police continue to investigate. Randy Kessler, it's always great to have you on Law and Crime. Thanks for talking about this with us.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Frattolin is reportedly expected back in court on Friday this week. That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.